Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Tourismus Namibia, our live broadcast that we bring you each Saturday morning. As normal, we have the three categories which we bring you, one being topics, then we've got destinations, and then obviously right at the end to the point. Welcome to the show once again. My name is Frank Steffen. I'm the editor of Tourismus magazine, the monthly edition of Tourismus magazine, and obviously also editor of the German daily Allgemeine Zeitung. So first up, we've got topics, but before we go there, let's just quickly see what the market has to tell us.
If you're feeling it, I'm feeling, and you know I won't stop. All we gotta do is take our love to the top. If I got it and you want it and you'll never let it drop. All we gotta do is take our love to the top. I will ride for you, baby, even die for you. When I'm loving you, but my heart don't stop.
Topics, yeah, I've actually got one serious item this week. It's a bit disconcerting. We have a so-called whistleblower page these days that seems to hone in on the tourism sector, and obviously I don't mind when people really have something to say and there's some serious allegation that needs to be tested. But it would seem as though at this stage many of these allegations are unfounded. So previously quite a number of newspapers actually wrote about it, the fact that there were some allegations that the Hospitality Association of Namibia, HAN, had some serious things going on, issues with money that was embezzled and stuff like that. Nothing proven, and it seems as if there's no real proof of any irregularity. So I don't really know where it's heading, but in the past week we suddenly had the same allegation about ISAP, which is obviously the system that, you know, it's something that was born from the private sector, and it enjoyed quite a bit of support over the years. Many of you would know it. And suddenly there were allegations that these guys had misappropriated funds or basically allowed themselves big salaries as opposed to expenses that should have been carried. Be it as it may, contrary to HAN, ISAP actually decided to answer. Their CEO, Fritz Kaufmann, actually reacted and reacted quite detailed, exactly what was going on and for what the money has been used. I know for a fact that we previously on this show actually showed you a video for a unit that they built on one of the farms where they do some quite intensive training in terms of birding, in terms of snake knowledge, teaching people how to be guarding against poaching, and also understanding what protection of the species is involved with. So yeah, I doubt it. We actually still showed you on that show that they were effectively also bringing actually having a little nursery in which they raise camel thorn trees, and which they make available to the public and to farmers especially. And even that project was suddenly something that was seen or was actually belittled. So quite sad. I don't mind if people go against crime or misappropriation of public funds, but then that should really be substantiated and not just a loose allegation. So yeah, that is my opinion about that. Up next, poaching again. And the Minister of Environment and Tourism, or Environment, Forestry and Tourism, this week actually gave out his annual report. And in that report, he was able to give a little analysis of which species were the most targeted. But apart from that, he actually reverted and said more than 300 poaching suspects were arrested in the past year, and unfortunately the poaching of pangolin is on the rise. Many countries have actually seen an increase during COVID in poaching during COVID, but Namibia decreased. So rhino cases were only 25, but all in all 191 arrests took place. So that was quite a number that went up. So all in all, they seem to be doing well. Unfortunately, 59 pangolin cases of dead animals were recorded, and 74 were actually recorded dead or alive, or in terms of products running around there. And what I find quite sad is the antelopes that were poached. They ranged basically from Damara Dik Dik to Eland. And I don't know, many of you won't necessarily know what a Damara Dik Dik is in terms of size, but I'll tell you it's no more than that. And whoever wants to poach that and tell me that he does that for food, I think is lying, to be dead honest. So this is not something that has occurred because of need, but this is simple greed, or I don't know what else. So that's as far as poaching is concerned, but generally that poaching report gives us quite a good picture. And I'm one of the people on record that say that the MEFT is actually doing quite a good job. Obviously with support from all over, but nevertheless, there needs to be the will to actually help. And then we come to another poaching incident. So this week was a bit riddled with poaching. Rhino poaching, and so 5 suspects were arrested in connection with wildlife crimes in 3 separate cases last week, and 3 of these were arrested in connection with rhino poaching and or trafficking. So that thing still has to go on. This was near Khubabis, and in the process, a hunting rifle and 22 rounds of ammunition were also confiscated. And in a separate case, then there were 2 people who were arrested for being in possession of 2 rhino horns. So they were both charged with contravening the Controlled Wildlife Products and Trade Act, and being in illegal possession of and dealing in controlled wildlife products. So in their case, 1 vehicle was also confiscated. So, and then finally at Utapi, that's up in the north in Namibia and Angola, and were arrested in possession of a pangolin skin. So sad. On the one hand, we've got this report that actually does better reading than you would have expected, but then on the other hand, we've got our first cases, or not our first cases, but another few cases again. I suppose it's one of those things that one has to live with, but obviously I'm never happy to report on that. But I feel it's important that people know about it, because otherwise how do we fight it? So those are 3 items that I thought were worthwhile bringing to you this week. So up next, we've got destinations, a much nicer theme. Welcome back, and up first we obviously have the Uchu, no, which one do we have first? I'm actually talking to my Emmanuel Lodge, sorry for that. That's the problem with going live and not really knowing what you want to bring in first. Yes, I actually drove out to Emmanuel Lodge. It was on the spur of the moment, and met up with Stefan Hock and his wife Sabine. Obviously they weren't expecting me, which is possibly a good thing, but have a look at the video that we compiled for you. Wir sind hier in der Emmanuel Lodge, und zwar gleich außerhalb von Windhoek, und vor mir sitzt Stefan Hock. Also hallo Stefan erstmal.
Hallo Frank.
Ja, und wie Sie wissen, bringen wir jede Woche immer so noch eine Lodge oder irgendeinen neuen Urlaubsort, den wir gerne vorstellen. Und da habe ich einfach so auf Anhieb beschlossen, ich komme hier mal schnell vorbei. Stefan, erzähl uns ein bisschen. Wir fingen gerade an zu erzählen, da meinte ich zu ihm, er soll erst Luft holen, dass ich die Kamera bereit habe. Erzähl uns ein bisschen, wie geht's hier?
Ja, uns hat natürlich Corona auch getroffen. Die Urlauber aus nah und fern, die bleiben zurzeit etwas aus. Aber wir versuchen einfach das Beste daraus zu machen, versuchen nicht den Kopf in den Sand zu stecken, sondern die Ärmel hochzukrempeln. Wir haben das Konzept ein wenig umgestellt, im Moment auch sehr stark für die Locals, die am Wochenende dann uns besuchen kommen, den Pool genießen, sich hier bei uns aufhalten. Wir haben im Restaurant alles umgestellt, von einem Setmenü auf à la carte. Man kann also zurzeit von Freitagabend bis Sonntagabend dann mittags à la carte hier essen. Wir haben ein Kaffee- und Kuchenbuffet am Nachmittag und am Abend dann essen und dann am Abend wieder das à la carte Geschäft mit gewissen Spezialitäten. Wir sind ja vor einigen Jahren mal als bestes Restaurant Namibias ausgezeichnet worden. Und wir freuen uns einfach, unsere Gäste zu verwöhnen, kulinarisch, auch mit Massagen, mit dem Wohlfühlcharakter hier, den man hier auf dieser Lodge genießen kann.
Ja, und diese Lodge ist ja nicht weit außerhalb Windhoek. Ich meine, das ist ja ein Katzensprung, oder?
Das ist richtig. Du brauchst letztendlich nur 10 bis 15 Minuten aus Windhoek mit dem Auto hier raus und hast trotzdem gleich das Gefühl, im afrikanischen Busch zu sein.
Ja, das ist mir nicht eben aufgefallen und dann habe ich da eben auch die Fotos gemacht von den kleinen Schildkröten und so weiter. Das sind ja so kleine, ja, wir haben immer früher bei der Namibia Tourismus Expo haben wir immer gesprochen von Small Things Matter und das ist wirklich manchmal so, ne?
Ja. Wir versuchen wir sagen auch bei uns, Software beats Hardware. Es geht darum, dass wir einfach für unsere Gäste da sind, dass die Gäste sich hier wohlfühlen können, dass sie sich erholen können in den wenigen Stunden, die sie bei uns sind. Das ist unser Hauptanliegen.
Ja. Und wie ist das jetzt eigentlich mit Tourismus aus Deutschland? Schon hier und da wieder ein paar Leute. Ich traf jetzt eben einen Herrn am Schwimmbad, der ließ sich sogar fotografieren, freundlicherweise. Ja, und man weiß ja immer nicht, ob Leute unbedingt so dafür zu finden sind. Aber gibt es da wieder mehr?
Wir haben jetzt im Moment wieder verstärkt Gäste auch aus dem Ausland. Die neue Corona-Regelung, dass also die Gäste mit einem negativen Corona-Test in das Flugzeug einsteigen müssen, hilft uns im Moment, weil dadurch die Gäste sich 1 bis 2 Tage hier in Windhoek aufhalten müssen am Ende der Reise. Und da profitieren wir im Moment davon. Da sind wir auch sehr glücklich darüber.
Ja, ist ja klar. Ich meine, jedes bisschen hilft jetzt, ne?
Ja, wir helfen auch unseren Gästen, weil das mit dem Corona-Test nicht immer ganz einfach ist. Dann sind die Ergebnisse nicht immer rechtzeitig da und da sind wir oft auch bis in den Abend dann nachher damit beschäftigt und helfen unseren Gästen, dass sie dann nachher alle Unterlagen zusammen haben, bevor sie dann in den Flieger reinsteigen. Auch ein Test hier auf der Lodge ist möglich.
Ach ja, einfach hier lokal. Ihr habt jemanden, der rauskommt.
Wir haben jemanden, der zu uns rauskommt. Wir helfen unseren Gästen, soweit es möglich ist und versuchen also auch die letzten 1, 2 Tage einfach so angenehm wie möglich zu gestalten, trotz des Stresses, den man wegen dem Test dann nachher hat.
Ja, und wie ist das generell? Also hier das Restaurant ist dann oft ausgebucht oder ist es im Moment erstmal noch im Aufbau?
Während der Woche ist es relativ ruhig hier bei uns. Dort sind, wie gesagt, dann in der Regel die Übernachtungsgäste, die wenigen dann nachher bei uns. Übers Wochenende ist das Restaurant Gott sei Dank recht gut gefüllt. Wir kriegen einen guten Support durch die Locals, da freuen wir uns auch sehr darüber. Und
wie macht ihr das? Ihr seid ja auch auf Hohen Warte. Wie kombiniert ihr das hier mit?
Drüben auf Hohe Warte haben wir eine Managerin, die für unsere Gäste drüben genau das Gleiche leistet, was Sabine und ich hier leisten. Wir machen den Backoffice-Bereich. Wir sind aber selber auch immer wieder drüben auf Hohe Warte, um zu schauen, dass alles läuft, dass alles seinen rechten Gang dort geht. Wir sind mit beiden Betrieben verbunden und versuchen dort unsere Persönlichkeit einfach in beiden Betrieben auch mit einzubringen.
Naja, dann danke ich dir für das Gespräch und werde demnächst mal bei Hohe Warte reinschauen, aber allerdings dann mit Anmeldung, denn ich kriegte eben schon die Rüge, dass ich hier einfach noch reinplatze.
Ja, es ist immer schön, wenn man weiß, wer kommt, dass man sich auch ein Stückchen mit darauf vorbereiten kann. Du bist trotzdem herzlich willkommen, auch hier und drüben auf der Hohe Warte, und ich freue mich auf viele, hoffentlich baldige neue Besucher hier auf unserer Emanuel Lodge und auch drüben auf Hohe Warte.
Ja, und wir wünschen viel Glück dabei.
Dankeschön.
Right, that was Emmanuel Lodge, just outside Windhoek, and the friendly face that you saw there was Maggie. She was showing me around while Stefan and Sabine were actually on their way out there. Just to quickly sum up what Stefan basically said, it's only picking up now. They've only had few visitors so far. But fortunate for him, and this I can say from experience, sorry, Stefan is possibly one of the best cooks we have in Namibia, and they previously actually, they were seen to be the best restaurant in Namibia at one stage. So he's still proud of that achievement, especially considering that he actually comes from a newspaper background, believe it or not. And so he loves doing what he does and actually spoiling people. That's what he does best. And so really, even though he is German speaking, he can clearly understand and speak English. And so you're still welcome out at his lodge. And what makes it nice is it's not only that you're just outside Windhoek, yet deep in the bush. He actually also makes a plan that if you stay over in Windhoek for the last days before you have to leave again, he actually organizes for COVID-19 tests and makes sure by actually bringing people out to actually do the test. So there's a lot of things done for you by him and his wife, and obviously the friendly staff, as you could see there. So when I was there during the week, obviously it was not the best of times. It was not exactly brimming with guests. But he says he's fortunate to at least have a full restaurant during the weekend. So it is actually quite important that you book there. Just to sum up quickly, because obviously you couldn't all follow what he was saying there. But as you can see, very friendly person. And yeah, that's exactly what you experience at Emmanuel Lodge. Just outside Windhoek, if you come in or go out, that should be your first or your last stay. So up next, what I did is I spoke to Bertie Opperman, and many of our local folk will know Uchu, or near Uchu, Sophienhof, will know it for its wildspheres. But have a look at the little video that I compiled, and then I'll comment on it later. Yeah, sometimes one just has to not talk to illustrate a good picture. I just wanted to show you, I mean, each week we try and bring you different places, and the farm Sophienhof is really just a little jump out of Uchu as you go towards Korrigas. It's on the right-hand side. And I deliberately started off with the Wildspheres because you would be tempted to think, okay, so what about it? The Wildspheres is quite big in Namibia. This is where people come together, and actually people go there from far away, and you buy biltong and you braai and you do all the things, get together, have good music. So it's quite a social and cultural event up there in the north, which is nice because Uchu is not that far away from Etosha. So this would be typically a stopover as you come either from Swakop going up towards Etosha, or actually leaving Etosha and going towards the coast, or even back to Windhoek. So it's a really nice place to go to. And as you could see there from the photos, by the way, were all taken on that farm. And I actually asked Bertie that I could use them simply to illustrate how much is going on there. And even on the promotional video, you could really see there's lots going on there. And I imagine that could be a really nice stopover, especially because you can choose between a bungalow unit, one for 2 people, one for 3 people. You can actually have that VIP house you actually saw it with its own little pool there, and there's even the farmhouse which you can use, and for backpackers as well. And then obviously you've got the game drives and the walks and hikes, and you can actually have a guided bicycle tour. So there's lots to do there, and as you could see even on that video, you could see that leopard, you know, just walking through the bush there. I mean, surely most people now think, oh, but isn't that dangerous? No, it isn't dangerous, and the leopard is still more afraid of you than you of him. So as long as you do not threaten him, there's no likelihood that he would attack you. So don't go to wrong conclusions. The one thing that you could also see in those photos that I raised earlier, there was the waterhole, and I specifically made that shot of the waterhole itself. You're welcome to look up Sophienhof in the internet, and it's very interesting to see that when you visit their site, they've actually got a live waterhole coverage there. So it's not as if a video is running, but it updates a photo every 15 seconds. And you can decide whether you want to view a whole 24 hours or even whatever, or whether you want to view right now. And the nice thing is, obviously in the evening, in the morning, there's more going on at the waterhole. But it's quite nice, and it's proof that there is actually something going on at Sophienhof. So even during the day, if you just want to settle down and read a bit and enjoy whatever comes to the water, it's a nice place to just relax and recover. So those are my 2 destinations I bring you this week. Up next, we've got To the Point. Right, welcome back, and this week's To the Point will be a bit longer. It's not your typical interview insert that we would just bring you. Many of you have noticed that I time and again point to the gas and oil exploration up in the north, and that's in the Kavango region, which is regarded as one of the pristine, biodiverse areas that we still have in Namibia. And so I've noticed of late when I speak to some of the people, there seems to be that sort of opinion that, oh, you've already made up your mind and you're against this in principle. Am I against it in principle? As I stated before, as long as I have a protected area that should suddenly be subjected to oil exploration and very likely to fracking, because it has never been denied that they would take that into consideration. Recon Africa was specifically asked by me. And so as long as somebody starts threatening that sort of wildlife and protected area, yes, then I am in principle against it until he convinces me. It shouldn't be my job to accept what he or she says and then later come and say, oh, I should have opened my mouth. So as long as I'm not being convinced by them, and let's face it, the public relations exercise by Recon Africa is non-existent. So far we have been presented with a status quo of simply putting up an oil rig and doing your thing. So instead of just listening to me, what I did earlier in this week, I invited Jan Arkert, who's an environmentalist, to make his case on our show Africa Good Morning, which is a show which NMH produces every morning from 7 to 8. And it's Africa Good Morning if you want to look it up. And so I asked him in the context of Africa, and in other words, Botswana, Angola, and Namibia, to speak a bit about this whole thing and why he is against it, because he's actually a qualified geologist. And then straight 2 days later, I asked one of the reporters of, well, he's a science reporter and he contributes towards National Geographic, actually written 3 articles jointly with other journalists about this whole phenomenon. And I asked him about Africa as a whole. I didn't ask him, I actually asked our anchors to have the interview. But have a look at yourself. Both of them will play them one after the other. So just have a look yourself.
Now, during the past 7 months, activists in Namibia and Botswana have been continuing to be up in arms about fracking. Previously, most of us in Southern Africa had never heard of fracking because we do not produce oil, or more importantly, because fracking is a type of oil exploration and production unknown to us in this part of the world. Environmentalists seriously warn against fracking, as it is firstly not sustainable for the future in a world that needs to find alternatives at a time when climate change has such serious impacts on its inhabitants. And secondly, it's a much feared production method as it has serious impacts on our environment. The case in question is the ecologically sensitive region of the Okavango River in Angola and Namibia, as well as the huge delta in Botswana. We have invited the environmental specialist Jan Arkert to speak to us and explain fracking and its repercussions, not only for Southern Africa, but for Africa as a whole. Good morning, Jan.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure here to be with you.
It's good to have you. I'm going to go straight into our first question. Tell us a bit more about your background and why we are set against fracking in Southern Africa, and why this is a matter the whole of Africa should be concerned about as a whole.
Right. I'm a geologist by profession. I've been working as a geologist for the last 30 years. I've had my own practice for the last 15. So I am first and foremost a geologist, but in more recent past, I did a master's degree in wildlife management. So I wear both hats. But my involvement in fracking really stems from the situation here in South Africa about 10 years ago, when large sections of the Karoo were put under question mark about fracking. Shell and a number of smaller companies had acquired portions of land and were looking at fracking in this neck of the woods. Obviously, that raised a lot of environmental and a lot of concerns amongst environmentalists and many other people. And yeah, we have been reasonably successful. I only say reasonably because the story has certainly not gone away. Fracking is still very much on the government's radar. But at this stage, we have managed to keep the fracking proponents at bay. And hopefully we can do much the same in Namibia and Botswana with what's been proposed in that part of the world.
All right. How does fracking work exactly? Because I think a lot of us are asking that question.
Certainly, I can explain to you how fracking works. It's a highly technological process. It is a very complex and highly, it's a very clever process. As I like to say, it's clever but not wise. You'll notice in the backdrop that you've got there that a borehole is drilled from the surface and it goes down vertically right down through that blue horizon, which is basically where your shallow water table is, and goes down to your black horizon right at the bottom there, which is typically a shale, a tight shale. And the drill string is then curved and goes along horizontally. Now that horizontal portion can continue for a length of about 2.5 kilometers. What they do then is they pull out their drill bits and they pump in water and a cocktail of various chemicals. And under extremely high pressure, they then fracture, break the rock basically. That's where the term fracking comes from. They break the rock, and together with the water and the chemicals that they've originally pumped in, that returns up into that wastewater dam, the pit that you see there shown as number 4. The gas then returns to surface, and you have the whole infrastructure on surface. You have obviously the trucks that bring the water to site. It's a highly water intensive process, and ultimately you have your compressor stations and your condensers and so on, and your pipelines that then take your gas off to wherever it's going to be sold to, or wherever your processing plant might be. So it's a highly industrialized process, and what fracking causes is it is very intensive over a wide portion of land. It's very extensive and basically industrializes your landscape.
All right, yeah, I mean, we're looking at those visuals and it is hard not to be truly alarmed.
Yeah.
Now we move over to our next question. What was your previous involvement in terms of opposing the Karoo play?
Well, at the time, I was just a very concerned geologist, a very concerned scientist. I happen to know about fracking obviously from the work that I've done. And when I caught wind of what was happening or proposed here in South Africa, I made some inquiries, and I ultimately joined an organization called Treasure the Karoo Action Campaign, TKAG, and we were very successful in creating an awareness, and this is what I'm personally hoping to do in Namibia, is to create an awareness. Whilst fracking is not happening immediately at the moment in Namibia, we're acutely aware of that, and the government and Recon Africa, the proponents, have told us no fracking is happening. That might well be the case because we're still very much in the exploration phase, but we do believe that in order to determine what's happening up there, they will have to frack at some stage. They cannot determine the value of the gas find or oil find if they do find it, and they cannot determine the quantities and the viability, the economic viability, without resorting to fracking. So fracking will happen at some stage in the future if oil and gas is found in northern Namibia. And so knowing the dangers of fracking, both from a health perspective, the human health perspective, but also the environmental impacts of it are horrendous. And we can only look at the United States, where it has been happening now for the last 10 years or more, and learn from there. And you can see how just intensive this process is. Each of those plots of land are a fracking platform, and each one has to be connected by a road. Each one has to be connected by pipelines. Each of those fracking platforms has to have a drill rig on it and a waste disposal pit, and so you can see how intensive it is. In fact, you'll have one fracking platform at intervals of around about 5 kilometers each. That's around about one for every 25 hectares. I beg your pardon, 250 hectares, not 25, 250 hectares. So it is a a very intensive process. And obviously in the process of doing that, like in a place like Kavango, you now cause habitat fragmentation, you're causing potential displacement of people, agricultural practices. So you're now impacting on food security, water security, and a host of other things. So it has both social and environmental ramifications.
All right. Now, Jan, if you could just highlight maybe one or two dangers or risk of fracking for us, please.
Certainly. I mean, the biggest thing with fracking, as we've learned from the American experience, is the use of water. Fracking is an extremely water-intensive process. Anything between 15 and 16 million cubic meters of water is required per fracking event. And that water has to come from somewhere. Now, a country like Namibia, which is one of the driest countries in the world, and certainly one of the driest south of the Sahara, where does that water come from? And clearly, the only source of water in that part of the world would be the Kavango River, the Okavango River, depending on where you are. And that would have a direct impact on what then flows downstream, what is available for ecological systems, etc. But not only that, you also have your waste disposal. Ultimately, a lot of that water is now contaminated and returns to surface. And as we can see here in this picture of the current drill site in Kavango near Kawe, you know, is this what Kavango is going to look like in a couple of years' time, with drill sites scattered all over the place? And as you can see, it's a very arid, a very sparsely inhabited area, but it will industrialize that whole section of land. Now, obviously, where they actually drill and where they find gas, if they find gas, we still don't know. But the point is that if they do find gas, they are going to have to resort to some fracking at some stage in order to determine the value of that deposit.
Understandably so. Now, at the risk of repeating some of your concerns, why is fracking not considered as a sustainable development solution?
Well, first of all, fracking, about 80% of the gas that you from a borehole is returned within your first year. Around about 80%. So it comes through literally in a gush in the first year. Then very, very slowly over the next 8 to 10 years, the remainder, the last 20%. So what happens is they have to re-stimulate the well. In other words, they refrack it and they continually refrack it, or worse still, they might have to go and drill adjacent holes. So the economic model of it doesn't work, and that's been shown in the United States. We've had something like 250 of the fracking companies have gone out of business in the last 2 or 3 years. So it is not a sustainable from a financial perspective, but it cannot be a sustainable process because we're extracting hydrocarbons, basically fossil fuels. And we know that fossil fuels lead to climate change, and we have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. The world cannot carry on as we are now. In fact, we're on a trajectory at the moment, currently, with national declared contributions in terms of the Paris Accord of around about a 3.5-degree temperature increase. And bearing in mind that Southern Africa looks to have about double that. So if we talk of 2 or 3 or 4 degrees of temperature, climate change or temperature increase in the rest of the world, we can double that in Southern Africa. That's the predictions. So it is not a sustainable process, and we need to look at the alternatives.
Mr. Jan Eckert, thank you very much for joining us and informing us on such an important thing that's happening to our land and our environment right now. We certainly hope that voices like your own and others can be amplified, and the awareness that is needed to combat this and protect our land can certainly reach the places it ought to. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well, this is still Africa Good Morning, bringing you all the news you need to know happening in the SADC region and beyond. And we'll see you just beyond the break. Now, during the past months, activists and environmentalists have become quite active in Namibia and Botswana as a result of the search for oil in the general area of the Okavango River. This is not a development that only affects Namibia or Botswana, as we now see that Angola specifically said that they are following the example of Namibia and have started to also explore their nature parks for oil deposits. Yeah. Jeffrey Barbie has covered this phenomenon for the magazine National Geographic, and we have invited him to explain the danger of pursuing quick riches for a limited amount of time as opposed to sticking with sustainable environmental and tourism revenues, which allows for less immediate income but do place Africa in a unique position over the long term. Good morning, Jeff. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's fantastic to have you here. I'm going to go straight into our first question. Would you mind just introducing yourself to our viewers and tell us a bit about who you are and your credentials?
So my name's Jeffrey Barbie. I'm the director of Alliance Earth. I'm also a writer, a contributing writer for National Geographic. I work at the intersection between usually energy and the environment. And a lot of my work over the last 10 years is centered on the oil and gas sector and has focused squarely on Southern Africa and the choices that Southern Africa is making now and into the future, and how those choices are following either a renewable energy path or those choices are following a more traditional sort of fossil fuel method.
All right, Jeffrey, what are some of the biggest dangers to the African environment right now? And in the context of global warming, how do they affect it?
Well, right now we can say that the Southern Africa is the focus of a lot of interested oil and gas development. We have total offshore of South Africa. We have exploration just announced in the Zambezi Valley in Zimbabwe. We have this project that's been happening here in South Africa, trying to frack the Karoo for natural gas. Now for 11 years, they've been attempting to do that. So this is a problem here in Southern Africa that the rest of the world has been facing for some time. But I think the reason why this has happened here now is because we see the global fall in oil and gas prices, and we see regulation, which has prevented this type of development from going forward in places like France or Germany. So, if we're looking at other alternatives to this particular, type of development, those alternatives are here with us today. Solar is now about 1/10 the cost of creating electricity from a new gas field. It is also half the cost of a developed coal-fired power plant here in South Africa. And the South African government has recognized this, and so has the Namibian and Botswanan governments. But in South Africa, we get between 10 and 20% of our renewable mix in the country right now from renewables, wind and solar. And it's great because Southern Africa has some of the highest solar indexes in the world, comparable actually to South Australia, where they get right now 60% of all of their energy from solar. And if you look at an oil and gas deposit, and if you're going to make electricity from it, from the day that you actually discover oil and gas to the day that you produce your first megawatt of electricity, it's about 11 years. Whereas if you develop a solar field, from the day that those contracts are signed and the solar agreement is struck, you can have solar energy up and running in about 7.5 months. And those costs are coming down all the time.
All right. And, I was just going to ask, though, then, what would you and perhaps like-minded individuals, what would you want to propose to governments? Because it seems like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because after the COVID-19 pandemic, economies have been affected, and very particularly the tourism industry, which might impact their ability to take care of the environment. So what would you propose governments do?
Well, I think there's two parts of that question. It is a very good question because, of course, everybody is reeling from the effects of this virus. And it's one thing to remember that tourism can come and go on a yearly basis. But once you head down the road of oil and gas development, you're essentially choosing that path and none other. In one place that I've done a lot of research in the United States, Garfield County in western Colorado, it's a dry land economy, farming, much like northern Namibia. And there, when they chose oil and gas about 11 years ago, we saw all of the traditional farming methods, everything fell through the floor. So, We've lost our high schools in that area. We've lost the medical systems that supported large-scale farms that were there at the time. You know, people's livelihoods were crushed by this development. And the oil and gas business makes their money and moves on to the next place. And it happens in as short as 7 years, that cycle. So if you're looking at developing oil and gas instead of tourism, you know, what we see in tourism, and if you look at it in Namibia over the last 20 years, tourism revenues have gone up about 800 to 1,200%. And if you imagine what it's like to be sitting in Europe right now, stuck in a gray, cold apartment waiting for the summer to come, and all you want to do is come to Namibia, I think what we're looking at right now is a very small blip on the tourism horizon. But the choices around oil and gas will be with us for generations to come if people make those decisions instead.
All right, now Jeffrey, would you agree that Namibia, Botswana and Angola are treading on dangerous ground? And in contrast, where do you see African governments getting this right?
Well, it's interesting. You know, we see governments getting it right and wrong all over the world. This is not just an African problem. Like I was mentioning Colorado. Colorado has spent a lot of time and money developing oil and gas infrastructure only to see that that is a short-term gain, and has now changed path and has voted in people who are regulating the oil and gas industry. And many people are wishing that they had not gone down that road. So Africa isn't alone on this journey and can learn a lot from places that have faced this business before. You know, the fact is it's a company's mission to make immediate profits for their shareholders. And it's a government's responsibility to take care of the needs and futures of its people. But these two missions are not always linked, and often with oil and gas, they are almost always opposed. So when we look at the future here in Southern Africa, it's great because there's a lot of infrastructure that's still to be built. And it's a choice now whether it's going to be renewable infrastructure that's going to be with us for 3 generations, supplying power. You know, the world's oldest solar panel, I visited that in northern New Mexico. And it is still producing power today from 1953. So we need to look at these types of developments. And the neat thing, and I'll just finish with this on that question, the neat thing is that Botswana and Namibia have pretty much nearly signed an agreement to develop a gigawatt of solar electricity between them. As soon as those documents are signed and that project goes ahead, that could really do a lot to immediately, within a year, ease the power constraints in both of these countries.
All right, Jeffrey. So just finally and quite briefly, would you then agree that the more affluent parts of the world should support Africa in protecting its environment, since the world certainly expects Africa to protect its natural fauna and flora and its heritage, which benefits not just Africa, but the entire world?
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things that we're going to look at into the future, and we've seen it with the Global Environmental Fund and other attempts to do this, but there are groups and organizations, some governmental, some intergovernmental, and some private, you know, conservation efforts as well, that have really focused on making sure that foreign countries help support communities on the ground who need to preserve these environments for the sake of all humanity. And I think that in the next 10 years, we're going to see a major push towards that type of support. I've already been speaking with people over the last few months about that exact thing. And I believe that as more and more people come together to cherish these places and really value them in their heart, then that will translate into a financial value. Because what really does need to happen is that there's support for African countries, developing world countries, and even in America, support for native cultures and areas so that people pay to have those carbon sinks maintained. They pay to have that biodiversity maintained, so that we don't have another problem like the coronavirus pandemic, which probably comes from a zoonotic disease driven by the destruction of the environment.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeffrey Barbie, for disseminating that vital information for us.
Thank you very much for having me on, and keep up the great work, everyone.
All right, we'll certainly do our best. This is Still Africa Good Morning, bringing you all the news you need to know happening in the SADC region and beyond. And we'll see you just after the break.
Well, there you have it from the horse's mouth, so to say. these guys are certainly more experienced and more knowledgeable than I am, and I just felt this should be shared because it's not some crazy moment that Frank has here on Tourismus Namibia. These are serious concerns, and one somehow feels that, considering the fact that the public participation in this whole process has really been bad. Recon Africa and our government specifically owes us a bit more accountability on that side, and they need to start speaking to us, because you cannot approve of something if you don't understand where they're going with this, and especially if you have the feeling that they keep information away from you. So that's my take on this story, and I just feel that we still need to spend time on this item until we have the answers, whichever they are. It's exactly what Jeff and Jan are saying, is if we decide to go that route, don't go afterwards and say nobody warned you, because there were ample warnings, not necessarily only from my side, but from all over the world. So I find it sad that we don't try and learn something from people who've gone down that path. We're now hunting riches for 20 years, and after that we've got no future, as opposed to tourism, which is going to last as long as we look after it. And that's up to us, really. So on that note, I'll leave you for today. I hope you enjoyed the show, and see you next time, same place, and keep safe. Bye.